When you hear the words Black Death, what picture pops into your head? For most of us, it's this single terrifying wave of plague that just steamrolled across Europe in the 14th century, leaving absolute devastation everywhere. It's one of history's most epic and most tragic stories. And the number we all know is just mind-blowing. For centuries, we've been taught that the pandemic wiped out 50% of the entire population of Europe. Think about that. Half of everyone gone in just a few short years. That number has defined how we see that whole era. But what if that simple, horrifying narrative isn't the full picture? What if new science is forcing us to completely rethink our most infamous pandemic? Okay, let's get into this, because the real story is turning out to be way more complex and, honestly, a lot more interesting. All right, so first, let's quickly recap the version of the Black Death that we all think we know. The traditional story is that this was one uniform catastrophe. The idea is that from Italy to England, Spain to Scandinavia, the plague arrived and caused a near-total collapse of society everywhere. This single idea has shaped pretty much everything we believe about the shift from the medieval to the modern world. But this brings up a really big question, one that historians have struggled with for a long, long time. How do we actually know that 50% number is right for all of Europe? So here's the catch. Our old data has some major issues. Medieval records are, to put it mildly, patchy. The best numbers we have come from cities in a few well-documented places, like parts of England and Italy. But here's the thing. Back in the 14th century, up to 95% of people were farmers living in the countryside. Using city death tolls to guess what happened to an entire continent, well, it's kind of like trying to understand the whole ocean by just studying a handful of ponds. So to get around this huge blind spot, scientists needed a completely new kind of historical record. One that could tell the story of the countryside where most people actually lived. And they found it in a pretty amazing place, ancient pollen. This new technique is called Big Data Paleoecology, or BDP for short. It's a total game changer, using environmental data to answer historical questions. So instead of just relying on spotty tax records, BDP looks at the land itself to see what humans were or weren't doing. Now, how this works is just brilliant. Think of pollen as a tiny, natural time capsule. If a huge number of people in the countryside die, there aren't enough farmers to work the fields. So what happens? Fields of wheat and rye get abandoned, and then nature takes over. Trees and shrubs start to grow back. All this activity, the drop in crop pollen, the rise in tree pollen, gets preserved in layers of mud at the bottom of lakes. So by digging down and analyzing these layers, scientists can literally read the story of a demographic disaster written in pollen. And believe me, this was not a small study. We're talking about a team analyzing over 1,600 pollen samples from 261 different sites all across Europe. This is history being done on a massive scientific scale, giving us the first real continent-wide picture of what happened in the countryside. So after all that work, what did the pollen actually reveal? Well, it completely redraws the map, showing that the Black Death was more of a patchwork pandemic. This map right here shows the whole news story in a single image. The Black Death was absolutely not a one-size-fits-all disaster. The areas in purple, like parts of Scandinavia, France, and Italy, show a massive crisis. The pollen confirms a huge drop in farming, which lines up with that classic high death toll story. But then look at all that green. In places like Ireland, Poland, and parts of Spain, the pollen shows that farming stayed stable or even grew. The plague's impact wasn't a blanket, it was a quilt. Now, of course, the scientists had to be sure they were reading the pollen right, so they checked their findings against the traditional historical records we do have. And it was a perfect match. In Sweden, the pollen showed a huge drop in farming, which lines up exactly with tax records that show an economic collapse. But in Poland, the pollen showed farming kept on growing, which matches historical records of economic expansion at the exact same time. This proved their method worked. So, instead of one single Black Death, the evidence now points to at least 4 very different experiences. Some regions were totally devastated. Others saw a bit of a downturn. Many just carried on as before. And some parts of Europe were actually expanding and clearing new land during the pandemic years. There was no single story. This new discovery has enormous implications. I mean, if the death toll was so different from place to place, then the consequences must have been just as varied. And this is where we can really start to see how this patchwork pandemic helped create the modern world. The key takeaway here is that a society that loses half its people is going to face completely different challenges and opportunities than one that was mostly spared. This split sent different parts of Europe down wildly different paths. Let's look at the hard-hit regions first. Faced with these terrifying outbreaks, city leaders had to invent brand new ways to manage a public crisis. This is literally where modern public health begins. We see the very first quarantines, the policy of locking the sick in their own homes, military enforced cordons to stop people from moving, and the creation of special hospitals for the plague-stricken, the first lazarettos. For the time, these ideas were radical. But these new rules created huge social and moral conflicts. An English writer at the time warned that forcing people to abandon their sick neighbors went against Christian charity, against the fundamental duties of humanity. You had this massive clash between state control for public safety and the traditional duty to care for one another. And these new regulations were rarely applied to everyone equally. They often became tools of social control, used against the poor and homeless, who the authorities started to see as sources of both disease and social unrest. In some cities, a poor person who broke quarantine could even be put to death. But on the flip side, something incredible happened to the economy in those same places with high death tolls. Suddenly, there was a massive labor shortage, and the value of an ordinary worker went through the roof. For the first time, peasants weren't necessarily tied to the land anymore. They could move, demand much higher wages, and even negotiate work contracts. As you can see here, it was a world turned completely upside down for the survivors. This massive shock to the system basically sped up the collapse of the old feudal order. The decline of serfdom and all this new mobility for workers helped fuel the growth of cities and laid the groundwork for the market-based economy we know today. But remember, this was happening in the places that suffered the absolute most. Okay, so let's bring it all together. Why does getting this 700-year-old story right actually matter to us today? It matters because it shows us that history isn't just a set of stories carved in stone. It's a living, breathing science. The Black Death wasn't one event. It was a complex web of regional pandemics, and each one had its own unique legacy. By bringing new science together with old historical questions, we get a much richer and much more accurate view of our own past. We've just seen how a completely new type of evidence, in this case pollen, has totally upended our understanding of one of the most famous events in history. And that leaves us with a pretty big question. If science can do that for the Black Death, what other epic stories from our past are just waiting for the right new tool to come along and show us what really happened?